I want to welcome everyone to today's presentation, Offering Support After Loss Due to Suicide, presented by my friends Maureen Underwood and Marney Rohda. My name is Mary Fetchett, and I'm founding director of Voices Center for Resilience, formerly Voices of September 11th. And we provide long-term support for victims' families, responders, and survivors. And some of the programs, like the webinar that we're having tonight, really keeps people informed, and we try to focus on topics that are relevant for the people that we're working with and those in our community. Voices also supports communities impacted by other tragedies by sharing what we've learned over the last 20 years. And, unfortunately, there's more tragedies than we can even keep count of these days. So I'm honored to welcome back Maureen Underwood and Marney Rohda for this very important conversation, how to help those who have lost a loved one due to suicide. Last November, Maureen and Marney were with us to talk about suicide awareness and prevention. The suicide rate seems to be on the rise, and I think you'll probably be talking about that tonight. But what we find is oftentimes families who experience the loss of a loved one are isolated, and their friends and family members and their community are uncertain on how to support them. So Maureen and Marney will share their insights and their decades of expertise dealing with this very difficult topic. Now, just for a brief introduction, Maureen is a licensed clinical social worker with over 40 years of experience. That's 40 years of experience in helping individuals and families and communities navigate grief and trauma in a variety of settings, ranging from hospital oncology units to families and communities impacted by 9/11 and other traumatic events. Maureen has developed a practical approach that focuses on empowering those impacted to reach for post-traumatic growth in simple yet powerful ways. She's published widely on these topics and created an online training program that translates what she's learned in the field into practical life lessons for children and adults. Welcome, Maureen. And Maureen is joined today with her colleague, Marney Rohda, who started working with families and communities who have experienced loss in 2002. In the 20 years, that's 20 years since then, she has worked across the country in support of individuals, families, caretakers, first responders, and educators. Drawing upon her experiences, she delivers informative presentations on subjects of grief, trauma, self-care, and suicide prevention, and provides actionable suggestions for participants to bring into their own lives. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being here today. I know you have a lot to cover, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mary, so much. And I just want to say that both Marney and I are really humbled to be here with you all. We don't take this topic lightly, despite when I listen to the number of years we have together. And I'll tell you, my 40 is not really honest. It's more than that. But, I'm always just very humbled to talk about this topic. And, we gave it the title, A Complicated Loss, because that's, I think, what it is. And recognizing that the grief journey is also complicated. So that's what we're going to talk about. And as Mary kind of highlighted for you, I've been around the block a few times, and I want to give you some academic information, but really what we do with everything we give you that sounds kind of theoretical or academic is we translate it into everyday knowledge, because that's where we all live. And the first thing that I want to say, and this was something that, we were very careful about wanting to make sure we included up front, was our limitations for this presentation. You're probably going to learn very, very quickly that we don't have answers to many of the questions you'd like to have answered today. We wish we did. But hopefully we can help you understand why those answers may really be so evasive, and suggest there may be other ways to focus your energy about the person you've lost, or for whatever else brings you here today. The second thing that we want to say, and again, this is the part that's humble for us, is we appreciate your bravery in attending this presentation. We know some of you have been personally affected by suicide. Some of you have friends and loved ones who've been affected, and we just know it takes a lot of courage to stand up and look at this and look it in the face. So we want to acknowledge that right up front. What we want to say too is that, we come from the perspective that a problem well-defined is a problem half solved. So that's why we're going to give you a definition of suicide. Those of you who were in our other presentation, you heard this before, but we want to just kind of review that and explain why suicide in and of itself is complicated, and then some reasons why the grief after suicide is so complicated. In addition to that, we really do recognize that family grief adds to the complexity. So we want to give you some ideas about what to do about that, how to help yourself, or to help others that you may know who have had losses. And then to just briefly touch on the fact of how do you know when you really may need to reach out for more support. So that's what we're going to cover. You can imagine relatively quickly in the time we've got, but as Mary said, there's an opportunity for questions at the end, and we really hope you take advantage of that. So we're going to start with really what our definition is of suicide. And again, this is to help us all understand the event that we're talking about today. We use this behavioral definition, as we mentioned in our the last time we were with y'all, is suicide is an attempt to solve a problem of intense emotional pain with impaired problem-solving skills. So there's three parts of this that we want you to pay attention to. Obviously, there's something going on in the person's life, and usually it's a series of problems. It's usually not just one, but there may be a trigger that just is overwhelming. It creates such pain emotionally that it impairs the ability to use that frontal lobe of your brain to have good decision making. And somehow suicide seems like the only way out. Why suicide is so complicated, and I think that this is kind of the way most of us feel at the end of every day today about life being complicated. But the complications of suicide are really very well defined. And these are well defined in a lot of the research and literature about suicide. So I want to be clear about this. This isn't what Marney and I think based on our years of experience. This is what we know from a lot of people who've worked in the field. The complicators of suicide, first of all, is the reality that there's always more than one reason for a suicide. It's never just one thing. It's often a combination of things that just kind of come to the place where it feels like the straw that breaks the camel's back. People think about suicide for, often, I'm sure some of you know people who thought about it for years, but they don't do anything about it. It isn't often until that triggering event happens that you feel you can't take anymore. The second thing that makes suicide complicated is that we talk about those feelings of wanting to die, and we call those suicidal impulses. They come and they go. They're not consistent. Marney and I do a lot of work in schools, and those of you with kids know that, when a student in school talks about suicide, they often get sent to an emergency department for an assessment. Well, they sit in the emergency department, as those of you who have been to emergency departments know, often for hours before they get seen. And by the time they get seen by somebody to make that assessment, they no longer feel suicidal. And it's an accurate, honest answer. The impulse has gone. So it's that coming and going that can be confusing. And this may be the hardest of all, is we can imagine, we can make up what we think the reason may be or the why. But the only person who really can tell us that answer is the person who's no longer here. So we make up things. Maybe we're right, maybe we're not. And that's the challenge, because if you need to know answers, you're stuck in that never, never land of not knowing. So what we want to do is give you a little bit of information that maybe can help you understand or make your way through some of this complexity. And this is a little different from the information we shared when we were with you before. And the first place that, I want to give you some data. And again, we could have overwhelmed you with just lots of facts and figures, but we tried to pick out some that really kind of honed in on some of the things that we found most important and helpful. And on the next slide, you're going to see here what attempters have told us. This was a study that was done of college students. So I will tell you that, right away. But they asked them the question, what did you hope would happen as a result of your suicide attempt? And this was, as you can see on here, there were 52 adolescent kids who were in the hospital. Their attempt was serious enough that they were in the hospital. And even though they wanted to die, that's what they wanted to have happen, the motivation, the reason for that, almost everybody talked about the fact that they wanted to escape from something in their life they felt was overwhelming. Sometimes it was a burden. Sometimes it was that feeling of psychache, the pain. And, if you ever think of times in your life, and again, grief sometimes puts us in that place of feeling what I think is very similar to psychache. It's that pain in your gut. Just feels like your heart is breaking and that pain is in your gut. It feels overwhelming. It can feel overwhelming and you're hopeless. There's nothing I can do to fix it. There's nothing you can do to fix it. There's nothing anybody can do to fix it. That combination of feelings often is what leads someone to say, I just can't take this anymore. We also know that there's a lot of research that talks about risk factors for suicide. And I want to be very clear when we talk about risk factors. Remember I said in the very beginning, there's never just one reason for a suicide. It's always kind of risk factors, they sort of pile up. And the example that we use, and I think this was the example we gave you last time, because it's just such a simple one. It's like risk factors for heart disease. You could smoke, you could drink, you could never exercise, you could be a little overweight. Those are all risk factors, aren't they? But they don't predict you're going to have a heart attack. They just say that you're at a higher risk than the general population. So these risk factors for suicide, that's all they are. They're just telling us that a person may be at higher risk than the general population. And even if you have risk factors in these different categories, and I believe we went into these in more detail last time, it isn't until they all come together. They're kind of like gears in a machine that it isn't until they lock in that certain way that they really put someone at that acute risk. There are some of us who have risk factors our entire lives and we never even think about suicide. So I want to be clear about that. Risk factors are not necessarily things that set off alarm bells. They just tell us to pay attention. And what this is saying to us is that, a high percentage of people who attempt suicide have some sort of diagnosable psychiatric disorder. And it could be that they have it for at least 6 months before their death. Now, the reason that 6-month window is an important window to look at is, remember I said suicidal impulses come and go. They may have been coming going for as long as 6 months for most people. And that's why there's a big window for prevention in there. And I think that that's really important to look at. We also know that folks who struggle with bipolar illness, that can be something that can increase their risk. And when you have more than one thing at the same time, that's what comorbidity means in psychiatric terms. Your risk is obviously higher. It's like those risk factors for heart disease. If you've got 4 risk factors, you're going to be at higher risk than if you have 1 or 2. There is a bottom line here, though. And I want you to pay attention to this. Rather than getting lost in that psychiatric diagnosis stuff, I want you to pay attention to the fact that one of the reasons it increases the risk is because the way that those psychiatric issues compromise our problem solving. When you're feeling very depressed or you're feeling very anxious, your problem solving isn't at its best. And remember, we go back to that definition I started with. Suicide is an attempt to solve that problem of intense emotional pain with impaired problem solving. So that's why those psychiatric factors increase the risk. The second area that we wanted to look at a little bit were those psychological risk factors. And you've certainly heard a lot about hopelessness. As I said before, kind of the definition of hopelessness is there's nothing I can do. There's nothing you can do. If Sigmund Freud were here right now, there is nothing he could do. It's that feeling like nothing can happen that's any good. And I think that sometimes in my practice experience, and I think that these were some of the times that were hardest for me when I was working with folks, who struggled with thoughts of suicide, is they really tried every treatment they could, and particularly medications. They tried different cocktails. They might have even tried, ECT, electric shock, and they had poor treatment responses. And it just was hard to keep up hope, when everything you tried just didn't seem to work. I think that, one of the things I can say now is we're spending so much more time on a national level looking at more advanced ways for treatment, different ways for treatment. We're expanding that treatment window. So I'm hoping that, the treatment response rate isn't as bad as it was way back in the day, but that's something that can really increase a person's hopelessness. Again, you think of if you're on medication for anything and the medication's not working, you get to feel pretty hopeless about it. When you're impulsive and you're aggressive, or you tend to be a pretty angry person, impulsive means you act, you don't think your problem solving maybe not so well refined to start with. So you can see why, if you're a little impulsive and you just kind of jump at it, that may be something that really makes you more at risk for suicide. And if you react with aggression, there are those who feel that to be suicidal, you have to be so angry at yourself, you have to hate yourself. So, if you're really hateful for other people, you may also hate yourself too. Those of you who are interested, you can look at some of the research that's been done on some of the school shooters. There's been significant work that's looked at, who those folks are and what goes on with them, and the feeling that their anger that's outward directed is really anger that comes in at themselves. And they often die by suicide or die by what we call suicide by cop. That psychache that we talked about, folks who really have trouble, just can't tolerate feeling distress. And again, folks who are like that. This is one of the things that many schools are working on now with the social emotional learning that they're incorporating into curriculum to help kids how to do a better job at emotional regulation and tolerating distress, because they're not skills that we've often learned. And again, having social skills deficit, and you'll see those social problem solving skills can be some of those psychological risk factors that just elevate the risk. An area that I don't want to miss, and we sometimes miss this, but I think it's important to take a look at, is medical illness as something that really can increase risk. Any of you who have lived with someone, or perhaps some of you on this call have chronic illness. You know how that disrupts the joy that you get in life, your friendships, what you can do. And if that's just something that you're really kind of struggling with forever, that can be something that makes you feel, what's the point? Some of those central nervous system disorders, those, folks who are challenged by migraines, we've paid a whole lot more attention in the last few years to the impact of concussions, especially as we've looked at, football players and the impact of that. And, how many of them wind up in pretty severe mental health crises and even being suicidal. That could be a reflection of brain damage. And then any kind of illness that really relates to some inflammation in the body, which again can speak to inflammation in the brain. And then there are some treatments that kind of predispose you to feeling depressed. Even though steroids, not only do they predispose depression, but as you know, they can predispose aggression. Having worked with a fair number of young men who thought that was the answer to everything. And as you know, that's a big challenge. And finally, I want to take a look at family and social risk factors. When you have a parental history of most particularly suicidality, back in the day when I started doing this, we used to talk about suicide running in families. And the thought was, it was role modeling. In our families, when things get tough, we can always choose to die. And in the last 20 years, we've begun to realize that it's not just role modeling. That may be a piece of it, but it also probably is brain chemistry. So, we're looking at the fact that it's a much more complicated, just as I said, this was complicated. There's a lot more complexity than even we know at this present moment. So I think it's important to really kind of pay a little bit attention and recognize it's a complex issue in a family, and it's important for a family to talk about it. It isn't a foregone conclusion because there's suicide in a family, it's going to happen, but it's really important to have a conversation. Families where there's some sort of abuse or neglect or parent-child discord at a very, very high level. I think it's so important to remember, there used to be a cartoon, and it was a convention, and it had a sign across the banner across the top said, adult children of normal families. And there was one person sitting in the audience. So I think it's so important to remember that all of us come from families where we've got stuff going on. When we have loss in a family, though, and nobody steps up to kind of fill some of those gaps, that can be challenging. We also know, and this kind of relates to some of those social risk factors, being bullied or being a bully, kind of falls on both ends of that spectrum. And as we know lately, a lot of the gender orientation issues, which also can include some bullying, some of the issues that we're seeing now across the country with limitations to care, to transgender children, to medical care. I've heard a lot of kids talking about, I might as well be dead if I can't be who I am. So I think it's important to look at that, and also the issue of, families really struggling to accept, this is not the child that I thought I have, it's a different child. And it's a challenge for me, and I'm working on it to be able to love that child for who they are. But there's a bottom line here. And I want to kind of reinforce that on this slide, just as we've reinforced it on the psychiatric slide. No family is perfect. Let's get real. And if you think one is, it's because you haven't opened their closets. And even if there are some family factors that increase risk, they are only a small part of the equation. I want you again to go back to that definition. It talks about that unsolvable problem, that pain, and those impaired problem-solving skills. And I wanted to give you one quote, and I thought this was, in its inarticulateness, so articulate. One 40-year-old woman put it, I couldn't find the words to explain to myself, let alone to anyone else, how empty I felt. I had no sense of life, so death didn't seem like such a big step. I want you to really think about those last words, because again, unless you've been there, most of us have reasons for living. We hold them dearly, but when you've lost that and you can't see any reason to go on, death isn't that far down the road. So hold on to that. So that kind of is our summation. And again, I wanted to start, Marney and I talked about why we wanted to review this with you, is because again, it's that well-defined problem. The better you can understand perhaps how the person you loved who may have died by suicide was feeling, the better able you are to be empathic to where they were and why they made such a desperate choice. But I thought it was also important to look at, and I again, we're very, very clear about the language we use. And we talk about the grief we carry, those of us who are left behind. This isn't carry-on baggage, it's trunk loads. It's trunk loads, and it's burdens many of us feel we're carrying on our backs. And we wanted to start with a very brief quote from a poem by one of our favorite authors, and we may have had this in our last time. We use it all the time because we like it so much. This is by Mary Oliver, and it's from her poem In Blackwater Woods. To live in this world, she writes, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it. And when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. And that's what grief is all about, the process of letting go. The definition that we're going to use, and again, we talked about this. I don't know if we talked about this last time or not, Marney, but this is a definition from Keanu Reeves. We want you to see that we find wisdom in every corner of the universe. And this was a definition he gave to that famous question on, Jimmy Kimmel asked him what death was. And he said, it's what happens when you die. And he said, the people you love will miss you. And this is sort of the natural extension, that grief is the natural response to losing something or someone important to you. And I'm going to turn this over to Marney, because she's kind of going through this every day with people in all sorts of walks of life, to take you through a little bit more understanding of the process of grief. Marney, can you kind of help us out a little bit here?
Yes, thank you very much, Maureen. The way I want to do that this evening is to start by talking about the tasks of grief. And these might be tasks that you have never heard of before. This is based on the work of William Worden. His work is excellent, and you could feel free to dive deeper into his work. But what we love about his work is he identifies these tasks of grief. Tasks meaning work. Grief is work. And any of us who have experienced grief of any kind know that. We know that there's work involved. So his tasks of grief, and I'm going to go through them each individually, but to take a look at the full picture, there's just 4 of them. And they go like this: to first accept the reality of a loss, to experience the feelings of that loss, to adjust to the changed environment, and finally, and this is the eloquent one, to emotionally relocate the deceased and go on with life. So I'm going to go through them each individually. But before I do that, what I want to mention is that Maureen's definition of grief, which was the natural response to losing something or someone important to you, which is to say that we grieve more than just losses by death. And when we go through these tasks of grief, you can think about somebody you know who is grieving or your own personal loss. And this is not, again, just grief's loss due to death, it's loss due to anything. And through the course of our lives, one particular loss could cause us to go through and cycle through these tasks multiple times. So it's not a one and done. In reality, we're often reminded of a loss. And when we're suddenly reminded of a loss that we experienced previously, we can, having already gone through all 4 tasks, go right back up to the top again and have to sort of re-accept the reality of the loss. That's what those loss reminders do to us, is they bring us back to the tasks of grief and we start from the beginning again, which is to say, when you think to yourself, I thought I was over this, why am I going backwards? You're not going backwards. You are moving forward in life and you're just re-experiencing that feeling and having to walk through the tasks again. So to give that some concrete information, the first task is accepting the reality of the loss. One of the ways to do that and work on that is to name what you have lost. And that loss is potentially a person, but it is also your relationship with that person, the roles that person had in your life, what that person meant to you. All of those things play into that loss. And so the naming of what you lost can be very personal and again can change in time. The name that you gave a loss last year might have a different name this year. The next part I want to mention is, because I want to be really clear, we live in the real world here. The word acceptance might be hard for some of you. And we want to give you permission to come back to us and say, I can never accept what happened, because people have said that to us. I can't accept it. And if you can't accept something, what we're going to ask you to do is consider acknowledging the reality of the loss. If you struggle with the idea of acceptance, you can change the language. And again, because we give a lot of importance to language, and if you can't accept a loss, then the task would be to acknowledge the loss, acknowledge the reality of the loss. Know that there's always healing power with time, but it does, for many people, some losses will stay there forever. And the time that it takes is completely yours, and nobody can tell you when it's time. It is yours to own. And that being said, you also, any of us who have experienced loss know that different family members have different timelines. Some family members move in one direction at one pace, and some other family members will move in one direction at a different pace. And that's completely okay. But that can be one of the complicating factors of loss, because although you're all experiencing the same loss in some ways, you're all experiencing it in different time frames with different agendas and different feelings. And finally, I also want to give you an idea about this redefining the words moving on. I think you've probably heard people say to people who are grieving, it's time to move on. And what we want to say about that is, we've had people tell us, just like they said they don't want to accept, moving on isn't the right language. For some people, moving on has a sense of moving away, which doesn't feel right to them. And what we would then again reframe is, feel free to redefine moving on into going on. You might not be able to move on, but perhaps you can find a way to go on. So that's that first task. The second task is the one that most people think about when they think about, some people talk about the stages of grief. That brings into account the feelings. The task of grief, different than the stages of grief, says that you have to experience the feelings that you personally have associated with grief. And not everybody's going to have all the feelings, and you're not going to have them in a neat order either. People tend to grieve with integrity the way they live. So some people are the kind of people who get angry when things happen to them. Those people are more likely to have more anger in their grief. Some people don't get angry, and they might not get angry. They might never go through the angry stage of grief because that's not how they live. So people grieve the way they live, and that's how they'll experience the feelings. There's no one right way or order of feelings. There's no one right feeling to feel. You don't have to feel anything. There's a very normal range of feelings. Sometimes feelings are very, very intense. Sometimes feelings will become a little bit duller. There's that non-linear sequence is important to understand. And you have to be prepared for the fact that you're going to have setbacks. You will have been very sad and been feeling in a lot of pain about a loss. You will get to a point of your life where you feel better about it. And then maybe a setback will come, often because a loss reminder will bring you back to the top of the tasks of grief. And you'll all of a sudden have that moment where you think, they're not here. This is where this person would have done this for me. This is when I would have called this person to share this information. It brings you back up to having to accept the loss. And as soon as you do that, you're going to have some feelings. Probably over time, the intensity of the feelings that you have when this occurs will begin to diminish, but it will still happen. And there could be times when the feelings come back strong again. And which is to say also that, you want to watch yourself and be alert for complications. If you notice that your feelings seem to you to be disproportionate to what's happening, you want to pay attention to it and notice them. But in general, what happens is it's very normal to re-experience feelings that have some degree of intensity after a loss when you have a reminder of that. The third task is then moving to the idea that your environment no longer has the deceased. Every death, every loss leaves a hole, leaves a space in your life. And there is a part of this task is about really accepting the fact that that is true, that there is a hole. So the size of the hole in your life will depend on the significance of the loss that you're experiencing. If the loss is a death, people who are more important to you, who you spent more time with, will leave a larger hole than people who you spent less time with. And which is also to say that for some people, the actual concrete loss of a specific person, that's a concrete loss. It can, in this instance, be easier to grieve than all those symbolic losses. So the symbolic losses are, I lost this person, I lost my father, this person in my life is gone, and here's all the roles he played, the symbolic losses. He was the one I would call when I got really good news. My first phone call was to my dad. And it's that symbolic loss that can be harder to grieve than the concrete loss, partially because it's a little bit harder to grasp or explain or understand or even realize why you're noticing that hole in your life. The truth is, though, even the smallest losses must be mourned. Remember someone or something in your life, losses of roles and responsibilities, losses of the dreams of what your life was going to turn out. All those losses also must be mourned. And every time you notice a new loss, you start the process again. And the important thing about that is the fact that this new environment without the deceased, especially if there's a young person who loses a parent figure or someone in their life, every milestone, every time that child reaches a new developmental milestone, they will re-experience a loss of the parent because that's really a new loss. Now I am this age, and this is the role I would have had with my parent who's no longer here, and that's going to trigger a new loss. So that's the third task of grief, and it moves us into the fourth, which is where we want to try to stay more often than not. Again, acknowledging this is not a destination that you just park your flag in and stay at. You get here and then you leave here and you come back here again. But this fourth task is emotionally relocating what has been lost. And this is where we go on, not move on, we go on with our lives. This is the place where you're going to realize you are holding not what you've lost, but what you are holding in your heart. And in that place, when you get here, the sense of constant loss will be diminished, and you'll be able to handle some of those pangs and those feelings of loss and come to a place where it's okay with you for you to be happy and enjoy your life, and you will not feel disloyal to the person you've lost. The way that I think about this task is this is the place where you are no longer very acutely aware of the absence of something or someone in your life, but you'll become aware of the presence of that person or dream or thing in your heart. So the focus is less on what you've lost and more on what you have. And that is the memories of that person or that experience in your heart. So with that, I'm going to give this back to Maureen, who's going to talk about mourning. And I think for starters, Maureen, could you maybe give us some understanding of the difference between grief and mourning?
Well, I think, what you can see, and again, this is one of those psychological terms. Mourning is usually what the outside world sees. Grief is the more internal process. So this would be what people see in terms of how we undo our ties. And again, this is very psyche language to the lost object, to the person. What kind of focus do we have on the deceased? Is this person still such a critical part of our lives? I can remember when we were working with the September 11th families, and I remember one of the moms came to one of our group meetings, and she was beyond excited because she said, today was the first time in my life I ever made an important decision without having to consult my parents or my husband. I bought a car and I made the decision for me. So that was a reflection of her kind of letting go of that tie to her husband who had died, and kind of letting go of some of that focus on the deceased. You can also hear in that her focus on herself. This was what I did for me. So it's the development of a new identity, that I can be independent, that I don't always have to have this other person here to make decisions, run decisions by. I wish I did, not saying I don't want it the way it was, but this is the way my life is now. So there's more focus on the self. And this is interesting, and I didn't change this word because this is the word that is often used in psychology, is moving on without the lost person. And that was one of the things that our 9/11 families could not have been more adamant about. They were very, very clear to us, we are not moving on. This person who died is always a part of our lives, always a part of our family. We have to go on in that external world. Yes, of course we do, but we're going to be going on. We're not moving on. So again, I left it in there because I want you to see, you may hear other people talk about that moving on, and we have learned to very clearly disagree and use that other word for ourselves. And I guess the question we have for you to think about after this is all said and done, and when you can't sleep in the middle of the night and you're saying, what did those women talk about? What did they say? We want you to think about, as you look, those of you who have really been grieving and mourning, what trips you up most? Is it you continue to focus more on the deceased? You have trouble focusing on yourself? Or, you struggle in that larger world. It's harder to think of yourself without a partner or with a child who's in another place, or whatever it is, that redefinition. So just kind of tuck this information away. And, we believe that it'll come to you when it comes to you, which may be at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it may be when you're stuck in traffic. But just let those questions kind of linger in your head, okay? What we wanted to do, though, was not just talk about some other kinds of traumatic losses, but really kind of hone in on complications that are related to suicide grief. And this does come from a lot of the significant literature that's been done about suicide grief. Some of you may be familiar with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They were really started by a survivor who mobilized she was one of the founding members of that organization. And, she felt that it was so important to hear the voices of those who had struggled with suicide loss. And first of all, the fact that, suicide, it's always sudden and unexpected. Even when you're living with someone who might be suicidal, the loss itself, your brain just doesn't go to the fact that that could really happen. There may be violence in the situation. Sometimes it's taking overdoses of medication, but sometimes it's things that are much more violent, that are lethal. The search for the whys, as I said in the beginning, and this is something that's documented all of the literature on suicide survivors, it can be endless trying to figure out what happened and why. And the challenge with that is, as long as you feel like you need to understand, you have trouble with that acceptance. And as Marney told you, accepting the reality is the first task of grief. So the longer you kind of let yourself keep struggling for trying to know the reason, the harder it's going to be to move on with the rest of the grieving process. So that is something that happens a lot. And I am not saying it might not take you years to say, you know what, I'm never going to understand why this happened. I just know that it did. And this is the ways in which it changed my life. And that's when you start moving along with your grieving. We often know that many survivors feel what's called an exaggerated sense of responsibility. There's something I could have, would have, should have done to have changed this outcome. And in my experience working survivors, it often translated into some guilt about there was something I should have done differently. And when you feel that guilt, that can lead to feeling ashamed, or a degree of shame about what happened. It was kind of my fault. I should have seen it. I should have known. And in our lives, it's hard to talk about things we're ashamed about. And if I just think of my own life, and I think, well, sometimes I made some decisions that weren't so good. And, I'm not out there advertising what they are. I got a little bit of shame about them. So you can see how that sticks you in the process. If you really feel that sense of responsibility. And that's why we wanted to give you all that information that says, hey, look, you did the best you could. If you knew what was going to happen, of course you would have done something, but you really didn't know, because most of us just don't know. And that social support that comes, sometimes it's marginal. That's because it's related to suicide. And there's, people need to keep some distance. It's never long enough. No matter what the circumstance of the death, there's never enough social support for as long as we need to have social support. And there's also sometimes a perception, and this is again related to that shame and that guilt, a perception that that support is not available for you, that because it's a suicide, people don't want to have anything to do with you. And I've worked with so many families. I remember working with a social worker whose son died by suicide, and she was so embarrassed. As a social worker, she should have known. She would go 3 towns away from her home to go to the grocery store so she wouldn't run into anybody she knew. So I just share those things. That's why we really want to try to deal with our own feelings, because we sometimes, they interfere with our being able to go on with our lives. The other thing about suicide that complicates it, it can create what we call disenfranchised grief. And that's when a loss is, we can't openly acknowledge it. We feel that it's, not socially sanctioned, or we can't mourn it publicly. And there are a lot of people who feel that suicide is a loss like that I can't talk about that. I've worked with so many families with children who have, they had someone die by suicide, and it gets changed into they had a car accident or they had a heart attack. And as hard as it is to be honest about this, it's so important, because the damage it can do to the trust in the family system, when we're not honest about the significance and the reality of what happened, can be pretty profound. The other thing that can be a challenge with suicide is that sometimes it can create what we call chronic sorrow. And again, our choice of language, we use the word linger, because I think that that's what happens, is the death is always still there. It's ongoing, and the grief is ongoing, because you can't ever work through it. if you can't ever come to terms with this horrible thing happened. It's a lifetime loss. And oftentimes other people, they've moved long, they're going on, and there are family members who seem stuck with this. And, when we talk about the assumptive word being shattered, people aren't supposed to kill themselves. They're supposed to go for help. We're supposed to protect them. Especially when they're good people, bad things aren't supposed to happen to good people. And we really struggle with those. The assumptive world is something that, we gather assumptions about life when we're children, from our families, from our religion, from our friends, from our schools, and they kind of make up kind of our values and what lets us get up every day and go into a world that we could perceive as dangerous. And when we have to factor in that this terrible, horrible thing has happened, it can really make the world even feel more dangerous for all of us. There's also a challenge that there can be, some overlap with clinical depression and chronic sorrow, or people may see chronic sorrow as clinical depression. So we wanted to just show you that there really are some differences. When you're depressed, it's mostly your mood. And the depression is what's causing your lack of energy and engagement. With chronic sorrow, you're just exhausted because you keep trying to cope with this event day after day after day after day. Your symptoms are related to the loss. In depression, they make it, it may just be everything, but the chronic sorrow is really related to this particular loss. And the sorrow is going to be there as long as that loss is present and you can't come to terms with understanding it. It doesn't respond to medication unless you're depressed at the same time, and the depression may respond to medication. But we wanted to give you this information because we thought it was important, because I'm sure you know people who do live in chronic sorrow. And again, it goes back to that first task of grief, that acceptance. It goes back to that task of mourning, of undoing your ties with the deceased to focus more on yourself and the rest of the world. Finally, the other thing I think that makes suicide so very hard is that it has a bunch of unfinished business attached to it. It's not being able to say goodbye. Now, the truth is, I think every death brings unfinished business. I can think of, a variety of losses in my own life that I had a lot of time to anticipate. They usually from chronic illnesses, and I still feel like there's things I need to say to those people, or that I want to say to those people. And saying goodbye, that's another tricky one. Yeah, there is something about some degree of, and I put it in quotes, closure, because I'm not sure I believe in that. I think that there are ties that last way beyond death. So I don't know that there's such closure. But I think that one of the things that's important about this is that for you to think about, if you couldn't say goodbye, what would you have said in your goodbye? It's never too late to think about that, what you would have said or what you would say today as part of your goodbye, because it may be different than what you would have said at the time. So that's another thought we want to leave with you for the middle of the night or stuck in traffic, is what those words of goodbye would have looked like. And even if some of you got a chance to do that, would your goodbye be different today? My guess is that it probably would be, and that's okay. And it's important to give yourself permission to look at that. The other thing that we wanted to say, because this comes up an awful lot, is that, are you experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or grief? What's going on, especially when the circumstances of the loss were very traumatic? One of the things that, we have worked with through the years are, folks who are the first one to come upon the deceased body. And that can be extraordinarily traumatic experience. So there are things about suicide in and of itself that can be traumatic. So again, here's just some little tips maybe to see, do you think you're having some PTSD, or you're just really struggling with some of these complicated bereavements? Do you keep thinking about that event? We know with PTSD, it's that replaying, that revisiting. It's kind of like that tape that just keeps going on an endless loop. The memories of that traumatic scene continue to be there. In my experience working with folks who were the ones who found the deceased, that as time went on, they remembered more details. Initially, it was a flash, and then as time went by, a different detail would stand out, and a different detail would stand out. And that would be part of why the process took so long, because God bless our brains and our psyche. They only let us deal with what we can deal with. They hold back the information that we just can't process yet. So I think that that's some of it. It may take some time. You may re-experience what goes on if you go back to that scene. There are people who've had to move out of houses because the death took place at home, which is where most suicides do take place. Others who have had to change their route because they drove past the place where it was a public death. And that public context is, again, that shame, and that people know, you don't have the luxury of private grief. And I often think that that's one of the hardest things to bear, is that grief is such a personal and private emotion, and to have the whole world know that you're struggling with this loss, I think that that's really, really challenging. So this just gives you, if you want to take a screenshot of this, this just gives you a little snapshot, of what some of those differences may be. And finally, we wanted to, and again, we could do, and we do home workshops on the grief journey of families. We've spent a lot of years working with families, because we feel like they are often the most neglected group when it comes to grieving. We talk about parents, we talk about kids, we talk about adults, but we never really talk about families. And we think that a lot of healing takes place in the family, as well as a lot of hurt. And that's why it's important to think about the impact of grief that comes from a suicide on a family system. And what families need help with is how to communicate about the death. And I can't be stronger about this, is that it's critically important not to keep the suicide a secret. It is not necessary to share every detail about it, but it's really important not to turn it into something else. I've just worked with so many adults who had someone in their family die when they were a child, and it was a long time before they found out that the circumstances really were a suicide. They were told it was something else. I've worked with so many families who have felt, I want to protect my child, and I understand that, but the reality is we can't protect our children. We have to help them learn to deal with the disappointments in life. And losing someone we love to suicide is a massive disappointment, to say the very, very least. And to really try to help our children learn, what can they take from this to use in their own life? That's what's really important. Identifying and adjusting to those changed family roles can be harder, because again, everybody is so startled by what happened. And especially if the suicide took place in the family home, it's like, I don't want to go in the basement because that's where it happened. And that's where the laundry is. And I'm not going to go, and I'm not going to do the laundry. So it may be for the immediate and how long future, somebody else goes in the basement and does the laundry, or you go to a laundromat, or you do whatever you need to do to adjust to the changes in the family and the roles in the family, because this has happened. Understanding those individual styles of grieving is essential. You know, you've got some people who are fast track for everything, and you got others who are on that slow boat. And you know, it was interesting. Marney and I did a workshop on Sunday in a church for their elders about grief and loss. And it was fascinating to hear how many of these senior citizens, you know, when we asked them who they had come to honor, came to honor people in their lives who had died 20 years ago. That loss was still just like it was yesterday for them. So I think that the reason that we say you don't just understand, you want to respect it. You really have to respect that each of us has our own way of responding and feeling and cataloging losses. And sometimes that's that chronic stuff. It just doesn't go away. Looking at what future family challenges are going to be, that's stuff that comes up around the anniversary of the death, around memorials. If, you know, people choose to do memorials after the death, the community does memorials. Or what kind of memorials the family can have, not to reflect on the circumstances of the death, but to think about the value of the life of that person. And that's what's so critically important. And you can see how that's moving you through those 4 steps of grief. Preserving family memories. Everybody thinks you're going to remember everything, right? Right. That's why we really encourage people to write things down. This was what his favorite ice cream was. This is where she loved to go to the beach. This was the story about a dog that he told me. Whatever it is, preserve those memories. Those are the gifts to yourself. And I promise you, they are gifts to the spirit you have forever, and you'll lose them if you don't catalog them. And think of the gifts they are to the children. Now, I never knew this about my dad, we would have kids say when their mom would tell a story about when they had their first date or something like that. So it's important to let a family rejoice in the positive things. And never, never, never forget that families are strong and they're resilient. It's important to always go to those places. Even when we're sad, we're resilient. Even when we're grieving, we're resilient. And it's so important to know that we bounce back, maybe not as high, maybe not as far, maybe not as often, but every little bounce is a bounce in trying to get ourselves back to something that celebrates our own strength. Now, one of the questions that, you know, we kind of had, and we wanted to sort of address this, was there may be some of you who want to know, how do you provide support to those who are mourning? And we thought that one of the best ways to do this was to go back to those tasks of mourning and show how you can help someone who's grieving focus on the deceased. You're going to help them plan activities to honor the memory of the deceased. Encourage conversation about the meaning of the life of the deceased, not their death. We get so caught up in the circumstances of violent and sudden death that we forget to go back and honor life. And that's where all the good stuff is. And that's what we want to do. That's what we want to hold on to, are the things that this person taught us about living, not the message of their death. Focusing on the self, you may want to really help people support their own self-care. And one of the things Marney and I like to talk about a lot is plan some come up for air activities. What can you do that lets you just take a deep breath and say, and it may be going for a walk, it may be going to a movie, it may be dyeing your hair green, whatever it is, it's just something that lets you come out of your space and come up and breathe. We use this metaphor because it's like swimmers. If you don't come up for air, you can't keep yourself in the pool. So you're going to be in that pool for a while. How can you come up for air? And there are some people who could really benefit from professional help. Yes, there are some folks who might need therapy or counseling, but others just need professional support. So, you know, I don't want to go to the place where everybody thinks, oh my God, I need a shrink. You may not, but you may just need a person who can witness what you're going through. There is a great, great value in witnessing a journey, having someone there who kind of walks by you step by step and watches what you do. And every now and then, if you need to lean over, they're there. So we just want to, reframe that a little bit. It isn't always everybody needs counseling. Some people do, not to say they don't, but some people just need that witness. And finally, focusing on that external world. One of the things, and again, I think that this has been the gift that has been earned at such a great price, is that because suicide has become something that so many more families anticipate and have to deal with, and it's challenging, there is more support out there. So there are support groups. If you go to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention website, you'll find a list of support groups. They have activities like their Out of Darkness Walk every year that you can participate. And often you will see family groups or groups of families and friends who are just joined together, celebrating again that life and that walk out of darkness. And again, the last thing that we think that's really important to do is to remind that griever that the world is larger than their loss. And maybe that's the way that you just bring them flowers sometimes on an unexpected day, or you give them chocolate, which I always think is one way to remember that there's nice things in the world. Something that just touches them. You don't have to get credit for it. Nobody needs to get credit for it. It's just that the world can be kind and people can be kind in the world. And that can often help us get through some really, really hard days.
Well, like I said, we've gone way over, and I appreciate so much your generosity of time, Maureen and Marney. I know we're all applauding the wonderful presentation and all the information that you shared with us today.
Thank you all so very much.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.